This is a Dutch testing report tutorial. We make these to help you with the understanding of your results, but please do understand they're for educational information only and not for medical advice of any sort. The results that we'll show are not actually from a particular patient's results, just example results to help move the conversation along. When you're looking at cortisol, you've got a lot of data. We want to look firstly really at the cortisol pattern to see what it's doing throughout the day. Okay, so we've got 4 measurements. The waking measurement is a waking urine sample, but it's a reflection of the night's collection of free cortisol. Right? It's not a reflection of cortisol right when you wake up. It's a urine sample right when you wake up, which reflects the night's cortisol. Then the next 2 hours you spend typically at your time where cortisol is at its highest. So usually the results are going up around there and then back down for the afternoon measurement, and then the lowest point typically at bedtime. So what we want to do is look at, in your particular case, those 4 measurements relative to the expected pattern and see if there's dysfunction, not just in one particular measurement, but the pattern itself. Then we can add those 4 up and see how the total looks compared to what that normal range looks like. And we can see in this particular case that we've got within the range, but on the higher side for that free cortisol, which tells us that the circulating cortisol overall is relatively high. And then again, you'll want to look at those individual points to see when it may be its highest, or maybe some times where it's actually a bit lower. But that's a reflection of circulating free active cortisol. It's not necessarily a reflection of the production of cortisol, because it's only about 1% of the total free cortisol is. The metabolized cortisol is really your better marker for total cortisol production. And in this case, that is within the normal range, which somewhat confirms that there's relatively normal production of cortisol. So when cortisol is made, it's made by the adrenal gland. Okay, the brain signals the adrenal gland with a signaling hormone called ACTH. Cortisol is made, and then it circulates either as cortisol or cortisone. So cortisone is the inactive form. There's a back and forth action as it goes in different compartments in the body, deactivated, reactivated, back and forth. Because it spends a lot of its time in its inactive form, or at least it can, we also want to confirm that pattern of up and down cortisol by looking at the cortisone values. They're not of primary concern. Primary is cortisol, but the cortisone can help a bit in looking at what that up and down pattern of cortisol might be. And then the cortisol is metabolized, right, to cortisol and cortisone metabolites. And when we add those up, we call that metabolized cortisol. And again, that's your better marker for production of cortisol, because it represents about 3/4 of the total cortisol that's produced. So in a situation like this, where the free cortisol is on the higher side of normal and the metabolized cortisol, or the cortisol production, is also within the normal range, it seems that there's fairly normal cortisol metabolism going on. In other cases, you'll see where the metabolism might be greatly upregulated. So in a case like this, if the cortisol metabolites were way out here, then you say, okay, the cortisol clearance seems to be upregulated. Where do you see that? Obesity, high thyroid, long-term exposure to elevated cortisol, those sorts of situations. If, on the other hand, in a situation like this, again, where the free cortisol is high normal, if the production of cortisol was very low, you might conclude that there's low metabolism of that cortisol, which you can see in low thyroid cases, low liver function, those sorts of things. But again, in this case, it looks like the metabolism is moving along about as expected. So the other question, as it relates to metabolism, is, as we have this back and forth between cortisol and cortisone, which is mediated by an enzyme called 11-beta-HSD, which one's really predominating? So it's tempting to look at these numbers of free cortisol and free cortisone and see just which one happens to be, dominating the other one, which one seems to be relatively higher. The scientific literature would suggest that the better way to ask that question is to look at the metabolites. Again, the metabolites represent a larger fraction of the whole. So do we have more cortisol metabolites or more cortisone? So cortisol, again, being the active form if it's pushing over in this direction, or cortisone looking at deactivation you'll want to evaluate that, as it just adds to the picture of what's going on with a patient. So free cortisol over time, the total of production, and then any metabolic preference there might be rounds out the total picture for cortisol. So I hope that's been helpful. If you are looking for educational information, we have a lot more on our website, dutchtest.com. If you have questions from a patient perspective, please do see your healthcare provider with those, and we thank you for testing with us.